we were looking at DNA saying, look, in the braiding process in DNA, when you have bliss, the phase cascade of your EKG, EEG allows the recursive braiding of the DNA to create an envelope within an envelope where the wavelength of this braid is embedded in the wavelength of this braid with recursive phase discipline. That results in a condition in the DNA which is ultimately probably toroidal, based on the seventh recursive braid, makes a donut, causing implosion. And we suggested that that was the physics of the Lord of the Ring. Yes? That why the alphabet on the side of the ring donut, Hungarian Finnish, was from Alpha Draconis, which is a software environment for teaching genes, DNA, to absorb charge, because at the symmetry point of the helix, where the DNA is actually eating the charge field that causes it to grow, the codons are arranged tetrahedrally, and that's the origin of the tetra alphabets like Hebrew, and that controlled DNA's ability to swallow charge. And then we discussed the fact that when that was recursive, that torus donut would implode, here's the toroidal DNA, squirting charge through the speed of light, which is how DNA makes gravity. We discussed Gergelyev's work in Russia, measuring phantom DNA and black hole making in DNA, so that DNA is measurably a gravity-making device. So this is the background, that if you can generate the conditions to ignite DNA, you can become a star navigator. You can become worth a high salary in the dragon culture. Yes, you get the good bucks. So the skill to do that is say again.
You get more gill plants. You get to eat more pineal glands of near humans.
You get to use more of the resources of the galaxy and harvest DNA over many more planets. So the trick, the skill, the ability to create environments where DNA could be ignited became a galaxy-wide political drama. For example, the dragons, Asauru, who came here to Earth, were deeply concerned with generating the electrical conditions to ignite DNA. We talk about the Garden of Eden as a capacitor to prevent cellular aging. Yes? The Shem in the Bible, mistranslated, altar actually was Highward Firestone. It's a capacitor to make a charge field to ignite DNA. The dragons inhabit the right caves because the correct caves have the capacitive field to ignite DNA. So, our theme now is how does the real principle of how DNA is ignited toward the power of gravity making and star inhabiting, which is the destiny of DNA. Our theme is how that ability to ignite DNA is reflected in the major events in the recent history of DNA in our galactic sector. Yeah? So now we're about to embark on the story. The recent history of DNA in our galactic sector. Are you ready? Okay. Now, in the very distant past, many sources suggest there's something called the galactic core cultures. And the galactic core cultures, and I'm referring specifically to my teacher on Ophanim Enochian, vincentbridges.com, he talks about the galactic core cultures as being a group of cultures nearer to the galactic center who administrate the propagation of DNA across stars. And that they basically had an agenda which had to do with the discovery of the role of DNA in stabilizing star birth. Okay, so the agenda here had to do with this discovery of the incredibly potent role of DNA in stabilizing star evolution. We're trying to begin to understand why stars go through so much work to make DNA. Obviously, stars evolve a kind of intelligence that makes stellar evolution sustainable, self-organizing, fractal, opposite to chaos. And stars apparently do a lot of work to evolve life systems like ours, and we have to ask in terms of simple energy efficiency, what is the reason that stars go to so much work to make DNA? And I'm suggesting to you that the secret and mystery there is that DNA makes the gravity that holds stars together. This is a new hypothesis I suggest we entertain seriously. And this forms a kind of substance background to our story. For example, one aspect of that story is, if you read Reiki Reikop's story of the Golden Ones, he's saying that our seraphim, dragon ancestors, went 300 years into our future and found that for light years around the solar system, stars began blowing up, disintegrating. And that, this is called the Golden One story, soulinvitation.com/origins. And there, having discovered that star systems are blowing up, they went backwards in time to try to find the root of the problem. And they traveled backwards in time until they arrived at our time epoch here on Earth and discovered genetic engineering. And they discovered that when we started cutting up DNA from Sumeria till now, that was the beginning of the problem of stars falling apart. So a direct connection between DNA that's not set free and stars falling apart. Now that story, the Golden Ones, ends with those advanced high-winged dragons going backwards in time about 300 years in Groundhog Day motion to weld themselves back onto their own DNA and establish Sumeria to fix the bloodline of their own mistake. Like Groundhog Day, let's get it right now, let's get it right now. DNA is here for something. Maybe we shouldn't hack it up. Because DNA is required to make stars work. Now we want to understand more about the depth of that story, and that's kind of where we're going with this. We're saying that gene pools make a substance which is critical to stellar evolution, which something like when Doris Lessing says in the Sufi tradition, in the Syrian Experiments and Briefing for a Descent into Hell, if you've looked at any of Doris Lessing's Sufi books, she said, human condition makes something called the substance of we feeling, which is a sticky substance which holds things together. Ooh, what is this substance? So we're looking at this mystery of the importance of creating gene pools to inhabit stars, otherwise they fall apart. Another example we'll get to later in our story is in Atlantis, when they used the Tuoi stone, the fire crystal, to enslave people, and they phase-locked their grid, immediately after a large number of people were enslaved, huge earthquakes occurred in which the tectonic plates fell apart and gravity destabilized. And I'm suggesting that there's a direct electrical connection between large numbers of people that are enslaved, and therefore their electric aura is no longer self-steering, and as a result, their gravity field falls apart. A direct connection. That's what we're investigating here. Yes, so Atlantis fell literally because a whole race of people had been enslaved, and so gravity could no longer be self-organizing. What is the meaning of that part of the story? We want to investigate the role of DNA in the evolution of stars. This is the background now, okay? Specifically, when gene pools become enslaved, when people no longer become self-directing psychologically because their aura is no longer imploding to suck in charge to enable them to steer their own aura, the result of that enslavement is chaos electrically, including the destabilization of gravity. We want to investigate this story so we can understand the potential of our own gene pool, and for that reason we're taking this time to tell the story of the galactic core cultures seeding stars with DNA. What was their agenda? What were their methods? And how did this result in the Orion Wars? Where we're going with this, obviously, is when our ancestors said the only ETs that are worth talking to are onto the sun gods. And they're the ones whose DNA, there's electric field of presence arrived through the heart of the sun. So if they came, your friendly ETs arrived in heavy metal, you know they're from the wrong side of the tracks. They're messy. They're parasites. Whereas if they arrived through the heart of the sun, they're interesting. Talk to them. They're called sun gods. So Tuatha De Danann, Antu, Anunnaki, all these words with An in it, Daniel, means sun god. So who the heck is a sun god? It's obviously someone whose biologic charge field is able to inhabit the heart of a star and stabilize the gravity there. So in the big picture of these things, we have to grow up to inhabit stars or we can't grow up. That's the hypothesis. And we're looking at the electrical nature of that evolution, and we're trying to piece together the history. Okay, now, history story. The story is that among the galactic core cultures, there evolved a disagreement or a difference of opinion about the best way to seed stars with DNA. In other words, there we are going around. It said, for example, that the Dracu had seeded 300 star systems in the Orion sector with DNA. And there was a disagreement about the best way to grow up. It's just like a disagreement among farmers about the best way to fertilize their crop. Yeah? And this agreement came to be called Aku-Dracu. Akhenaten, Draco, Draco, which is parallel to the story of Ophanim and Seraphim and Lucifer, Aramonic, Michaelic versus Luciferic. So this difference of opinion became in religious history called the war in heaven. And this difference of opinion became fractal then later when we're on Sirius A and we have a certain family. The grandfather was called Alalu, and he was a former king, and a guy named Anu, or Antu, had a little wrestling match in which he cut off the balls of the former king Alalu, and this guy became king, Antu, on Sirius A. Now, we're picking a certain time in this evolution, in this story, to freeze a fractal of these giant Orion wars. And the time we're picking is the story of Sirius A and the evolution of the Nibiru story, Nibiru. So how did we get from here to here? Okay. What's happening here is that a culture that we can call Draco, or in a large sense reptilian, and we know there are lots of different branches of the reptilian culture. And believe me, we're not saying that all reptiles are bad. That's not the point here at all. But that the Draco reptilian culture had conquered a high percentage of the inhabitable planetoids in the Orion sector. This is the background of our story. And in the ancient times, this dragon race, which is called Seraphim or Uru. And Uru means giant or ancient dragon one, as in Uru Shalayim, which is Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem. And Uru Asa LM is the place where the female queens of, Asa means female queen of, Uru means ancient dragon one in the sense of Ursprung, or Uruan, or Roman, or Dine Asa Ura, dinosaur, or Asa Uru of Asuras, or Azores. That all comes from this ancient root, Asa Uru. These are the ancient dragon queens, yeah? Asa Uru, yeah? And this bloodline was also in the sense of the ancestor of the An, or sun god. You have the winged high dragons, high seraphim, who were called Archon, in the sense of archangel, and literally Arkansas, literally. Bill Clinton, Arkansas, that's the root, Archon. And Archon here meant, you could think of it as winged dragon or high dragon.